Clive, welcome to Clearing the Air.
Great to see you, Peter.
We've been looking forward to having you on. The blog that you run has been so influential in the harm reduction world.
Thank you.
It's called The Counterfactual. What's a counterfactual?
So The Counterfactual is my brand, my organization, my consultancy, my advocacy practice. So it's the vehicle through which I do work on public health, on energy, on climate, and so on. A counterfactual is a concept in policy making in which you consider what would have happened in the absence of the thing that you're focused on. So a typical counterfactual in our world would be what would have happened to youth smoking in the absence of vaping. That's a counterfactual.
And what do you think would have happened to youth smoking?
Youth smoking would be much higher than it is now everywhere in the world had there not been vaping.
Okay. There's another counterfactual that I was thinking about, listening to a podcast on the history of the tobacco industry. And it seems to me the original sin of the tobacco industry was not selling cigarettes, it was lying about how awful cigarettes were when they figured it out 100 or so years later. And maybe if they'd done it differently, we'd be in a very, very different world today. So it's a bit esoteric, but if that scenario played out and maybe we didn't think of nicotine as the enemy, what sort of a world do you think we might live in now?
Well, I think the way I would see the evolution of views in the tobacco industry is that they moved from a position of confirmation bias in which they were rejecting steadily mounting evidence that these products were extremely harmful into one of protective deceit, in which they, all the track record that they've got of lying and misrepresenting and sowing doubt and everything that justifiably became known as the merchants of doubt. In some ways, that's sort of human nature and what I guess you would do if you were in an industry that was threatened like that. I do think they persisted with that for far too long. At some point, they should have said the game is up. And they should have accepted, as they do now, that their products are harmful, and they should have warned about them and so on. The counterfactual history of the tobacco industry, if they'd done that, is very hard to know. I think they would be in a better situation than they are now. I think the tort or the thing that got them into all the litigation and all the trouble was the lying and misrepresentation. But it takes a hell of a lot. It was all right to say that with the benefit of hindsight, but how they must have faced that as it was coming towards them, perceived as an existential threat to their business. I think that's, I think it would be very challenging for anyone just to say, yeah, fair cop, we ought to stop.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that would certainly be difficult, but the reason I find the counterfactual interesting is because there does appear to be this split within the public health world between those who want a smoke-free world and those who want a nicotine-free world.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether or not in that counterfactual we'd all be much closer to thinking, well, what we actually need is a smoke-free world, and the acceptance that some people rationally choose to use nicotine, and we just need to move towards the safest way of consuming. Like, pouches could have existed 70 years ago, but they didn't. And maybe had they done something about it, we would be in that place now. We would have been in that place for 30, 40 years.
That's true, but we are in that position now, Peter. And remember, the vast majority of the tobacco control establishment doesn't want to go down that route. It doesn't want to separate out nicotine pouches, which have kind of minimal risk, from cigarettes, which have very high risk. It wants to lump them all together as generically dangerous nicotine products. So what I think you're getting at here, and it's a really interesting insight, I think, is the fact that in the past there were multiple objectives and motivations that all pointed in the same direction. So you could be against smoking, you could be against tobacco, you could be against cancer, you could be against addiction, you could be a non-smokers' rights activist, you could be worried about children, you could hate gruesome corporations. Okay, all of those were unified when we had the tobacco industry and it produced mainly cigarettes, and everybody could express their underlying motivation by opposing that. What happened later is that has all deconflated, And you now have to make active choices about whether you're against smoking, tobacco, nicotine, whether your interest is in young people or the public health case, which generally inclines you to smoke on older people. And the problem is the tobacco control establishment hasn't handled that deconflation at all well. It has basically said, well, we like it how it was before, thank you, when we knew where we stood. Everything on that side was awful and evil. We were good and righteous, and we didn't have to make any hard choices. And I think, unfortunately, that is where we are today. If that deconflation had happened earlier, I don't know that it would have been that different. We had a trial run with that with snus, if you remember. So there was a massive moral panic that started in the UK in the late 80s. That led to a ban in the UK and then a ban at EU level in 1992. Even though there was plenty of evidence at the time, people at the time saw that as a win because they'd got something banned. It doesn't matter that it was a safer alternative to smoking. It was already clear by then, it was much safer. It was already clear that it was responsible for holding down smoking rates in Sweden, Nordics, but nevertheless, people still wanted to run with the fact, oh, it's a win. We've beaten some tobacco, some nicotine. And remember, that ban was then reinforced again in 2001, the first Tobacco Products Directive, then again in 2014 with the second one, and there's no doubt in my mind it will stay in place with the third Tobacco Products Directive, which we'll probably see in 2027. So nobody has learned any lessons from that or found it interesting to deconflate the nicotine from the harm and then base policy on reducing harm. Nobody is doing that.
So what I find interesting about that observation is that I often conceive of this split in the public health and tobacco control community having happened around 2009. But what you're saying is that the fault lines already existed within the movement.
Yeah.
And you just didn't have to address them while there was a unified enemy.
That's right. I mean, I remember trying to make the case I was the director of ASH from 97 to 2003. And I remember trying to make the case for saying, well, come on, we should, in the 2001 revision of the directive, we should be trying to lift the ban on snus. It's obviously successful, it's obviously much lower risk, and it's obviously having good effects in Sweden. So what are we all doing, campaigning to ban this thing? Absolutely no interest in that, because it was seen as a big win to get something banned, even if it was a stupid thing to get banned, that was an alternative that was having good public health effects.
So should we just ban cigarettes? Bring in snus, bring in useless products, and just take cigarettes off the market for good?
I mean, there's people who say that there's people who, there's various forms of that. Let's just remove all the nicotine from cigarettes, which is essentially a ban on cigarettes. It's that people smoke them for the nicotine. There's people who say, well, if these companies who say they're serious about a smoke-free world, why don't they just pull out of that? The problem is the demand doesn't go away. And this is what everybody's not come to terms with, is that there's, first of all, there's a deep and resilient demand for nicotine, and then superimposed on that, there is a more fluid demand for any particular way of taking it. But that doesn't mean the demand for cigarettes would go to zero if you banned it and everything would flow into, vapes or pouches or whatever.
The demand for cocaine isn't zero, and yet we're still more than happy to keep it illegal. Just because there is demand for something doesn't mean we should allow it on the market.
Well, the question is, what is the market that we're talking about? So there's the market for nicotine, in which people will move between types of nicotine more easily than they will move from nicotine use to nicotine abstinence, okay? But there's also demand for particular ways of using nicotine, like smoking cigarettes or smoking cigars or whatever. That demand doesn't go to zero just because you ban a product and all the demand for nicotine then flows into these other products. People do like smoking. It does get people in a way that's different to a vape or a heated tobacco product. So the problem with these, there's a great guy in Australia called Wayne Hall who refers to this thinking of banning things, or he refers to it as victory by policy masterstroke. So we'll just take the nicotine out of cigarettes, or we'll just close down all the retail outlets and then no one will know where to buy them. Or we will just do a generational ban and eventually everything will be banned. What they never think about with those things is, well, what are the behavioral reactions to that? You know, people don't just say, well, that's it. The EU banned menthol cigarettes. Did all the people who like menthol cigarettes, did they just say, well, that's it, I will no longer I will comply with the intent of this law? No, there was like menthol cards, mentholation, menthol capsules, actually bootleg menthol cigarettes if you wanted them from outside the EU. There was, you know, menthol products that were made specially for illicit trade and so on. So unless you think about the behavioral reaction to legislation, you're going to get in a mess. And that's the problem with the simple idea of just banning cigarettes, is that you would get in a massive mess. As, you know, and again, we've got proof of concept for this in Australia. As a tax gets higher and higher, it starts to look like a form of prohibition, because there will be people for whom the product is basically unaffordable. They just don't have the money to buy it. And for them, it might as well be a prohibition. So what you see in Australia now is the tobacco market 50 to 60% illegal. And that's with a very tough jurisdiction. I mean, it's not like some, you know, banana republic, Australia. There's police, there's customs officers, there's intelligence services, there's people fighting organised crime, and still there's 50 to 60% of the market is illegal.
So why did the UK lead on this? You served in government, and the UK did take a leading role with the Behavioural Economics Unit initially, and then a much more proactive role in encouraging harm reduction than most everywhere else, and it was followed by New Zealand. What analysis did they do? What thinking did they do? What processes did they go through that other people missed?
Yeah. So I think what happened in the UK, there was a coming together of several influential factors. Okay, so there was a core of academics who were essentially the proteges of Michael Russell, who basically saw the concept of deconflating nicotine and harm, and understood, like Mike Russell did, that, you know, nicotine was a relatively benign drug, albeit dependence forming, but that the harms were done primarily by smoking. You know, and his famous, you know, people smoke for the nicotine but die for the tar, which everybody repeats, and it's more or less right. So there was that. Then you've got a reasonably, and because of that, also you've got a reasonably sensible, sentient activist organisation, ASH UK, which is backed by the Royal College of Physicians. So there was a history there of thinking about, there's overlap between the board of ASH, the Royal College of Physicians, and those academics that I'm talking about. Then you've got the Behavioural Insights Unit, or the Nudge Unit in number 10, which is like, this makes total sense. This is the perfect policy. You know, basically, it's a preventative policy. People reduce their own risk on their own initiative, at their own expense, take burdens off the NHS, improve their finances, feel better. It's a health inequality estimation. It's absolutely perfect for a behaviour change nudge unit kind of thing, because it doesn't revolve any public expenditures, just a realignment of people's preferences in line with their own health. Perfect. Then you've got you know, there's a whole bunch of people who are like, well, you know, we don't like the big state. Here's some innovation, you know, and I think people just basically went with it. They saw, I mean, there was a backlash in 2013 where initially 2011, I think the MHRA had tried to shut this down and say that all the vapes had to be medical, and that would have closed the market completely. And then most of the health groups in 2013 were campaigning for medicalization through the last tobacco products directive. It wasn't all plain sailing, but I think they thought they were doing the right thing. They thought this is what would make this tobacco harm reduction work, by medicalizing these things. I think, you know, you and I both worked on making the case that that would actually be a complete mess if they did do that.
And let's make the case now. Why wouldn't medicalization of the category work? Why can't we have some kind of a medical license for these products? What would go wrong in the market there?
Well, we kind of do. We already have nicotine replacement therapies, and that is what the medical licensing system has thrown up as what it is prepared to tolerate. So for them to be medical, there has to be a therapeutic indication, like stop smoking. You have to do clinical trials, smoking cessation trials, to prove that it works as a stop smoking agent. You have to be concerned about so-called abuse liability. So the flip side of abuse liability is an attractive alternative to cigarettes. In other words, it has the same dependence forming things. So the NRT manufacturers can never make products that are as pleasurable. You have to use very sedate and boring branding to get through the medicines regulator. And I think it enters the consumer's perception in a completely different place. Do you conceptualize yourself as a patient with a disorder that needs a therapeutic treatment, or do you conceive of yourself as a consumer who wants to use nicotine in a better, more interesting way than smoking that doesn't kill you and doesn't make you feel crap all the time? I mean,
we're getting at what I have sort of been thinking in recent weeks as kind of the heart of the debate, which is, I look at my own experience. I'm just one person, started smoking about 11 years old. I now sort of retrospectively rationalize that as a response to childhood ADHD. And it was a perfectly rational decision for me to do that at the time. It's a perfectly rational decision for me to continue to use nicotine today, as I do. And I like the fact that there is a illicit industry that can sell me a bunch of products that I enjoy using and have no real intention of giving up while causing minimal harm to my health. But what we hear, even from people in the industry a lot of the time, is nicotine, like the ideal state for everybody is zero nicotine use. I just think that's, and I just like to react to that, because I just think it's wrong.
I agree with you that is wrong, and I think they make a mistake when they do that. I mean, my advice to the industry, if anyone's listening, is what you need to do is explain why there is a demand for this. So the people who, the anti-tobacco, anti-nicotine organizations have a narrative. They say there is no real demand for this. All there is marketing to young people, predatory companies who want to hook them on an addictive agent that will keep them using these products for life and soak them for money. The reality is quite different. It's a psychoactive substance, and people like its psychoactive effects. So people find it pleasurable, they find it relaxing, they find it mood modulating. If they have conditions like ADHD, it may be stabilizing or regulating. Some people get cognitive benefits from it in terms of memory, concentration, and so on. So you put a list of the things that people can get for nicotine, and I look at it, I think, why aren't I using this drug? And I'm not saying that because I'm recommending using it, or I'm endorsing it as a substance. I'm saying that's an explanation why people use it. People use it for the hedonistic, cognitive, and sensory effects of using it. And that is essentially why there is a demand for the product.
And I don't understand why this argument isn't made more often. I've been involved in all sorts of industry campaigns over the years, and the line has always been, nicotine always bad if you're not already using it, and I just can't see that as a sustainable, and nobody would believe you anymore.
No, well look, how do we deal with alcohol? You know, the chief medical officer is not going to stand up and say, well, that's something you should use because it makes you feel cool and it makes you think you're funny and all this sort of stuff, even though it doesn't. So we have to understand it as a phenomenon in society. People use it because it works for them. It makes them feel better and feel as though they function better, okay? That's why people use it. So given that, and given that that is the foundation of the demand for it, all this stuff about, well, nicotine's use is about to go to zero, and all of that is nonsense. We have to deal with the effect, deal with the recognition that there is a realistic demand for this, and it's quite resilient over time. Once you accept there's a demand for it, The challenge for public health is how do you make that available in an acceptable form in a way that doesn't trigger a black market response around your restrictions on it. That is the challenge. But to get to that challenge, and that includes new users taking it up, by the way, teenagers try things that adults do, some of them like it and they carry on doing it. That should not be a shock to anyone. It's what happens with alcohol, it's what happens with caffeine, to some extent what happens with cannabis. It's not necessarily a good thing, but it just happens. That's something that, happens. So we have to deal with that in public health, and instead of wishing this problem away, we have to be more pragmatic and say, well, how do we deal with the main harms associated with that and make sure that the people doing it don't find that they're ill or they can't function, or over the long term they get really, really ill. And that means tobacco policy, in my mind, or nicotine policy, is all about harm. There's nothing else to it. There's a little bit of prevention work you can do, but good luck with that. It'll pull down demand a bit, and you should probably stop gratuitous marketing to young people. You should have age restrictions, so fine. But there will still be a demand. My hunch, Peter, is that the demand will go up over time, because as smoking fades away, the main deterrent to nicotine use is gone. And the main deterrent to nicotine use is the harms and antisocial aspects, the welfare disbenefits, financial costs of smoking. Okay, if those go, then I would expect there to be a rebound in the demand for nicotine. I'm not worried by that, because the use of nicotine will be so much safer than it was with smoking.
I want to close by thinking a little bit about the effect of the debate around nicotine and how dysfunctional it is on trust in institutions, trust in public figures, trust in politicians. You and I are old enough to remember in 2016, there was a very angry campaign run by a chap we both know, who I won't name, called Vapers for Britain, which garnered a decent amount of support, primarily from people who felt angry that the European institutions had explicitly said that they were agents of big tobacco, and they rightly felt offended by that. And there was a sort of a feeling where it wasn't, oh, the system screwed up, so let me work to correct it. It was, the system is screwing me, so fuck the system. And given where we are in the world today, we need trusted institutions like the EU.
Yeah.
And I realize I've massively led you on with this build-up, but is there a risk that the nature of this debate and the nature in which some stakeholders treat consumers leads to even more populism?
Well, I think, look, there's 94 million people who smoke, so roughly 1 in 5 in the adults in the EU. And there's maybe 20 million people who use alternatives, and maybe more than that. So that's, that's a huge number of adults who have essentially life and death health decisions wrapped up in EU policy. Okay, now most of them are unaware of all this, don't care, they're not interested. Of course, most people aren't engaged. But for the EU to approach that, 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 adults with a kind of contempt, if you like, about their welfare, with a sort of rhetorical gambits or talking points that they've picked up from these pressure groups in the Brussels hive mind, I just think is despicable. And in the end, there will be a price to pay for that. There will be a reckoning. And we've seen the health commissioner saying that vaping and pouches, heated tobacco products, have comparable risks to smoking. I mean, it couldn't be anything more ridiculous than that. He's the top official in Europe's main regulatory body for these products. What are people to make of that? And if the level of, if that is the standard of reasoning, science and argument, and I noticed that not one of the Brussels anti-vaping, anti-smoking organisations has bothered to correct him, not one. They're quite happy to have that misinformation out there. In the end, there will be a fracture. There will be a breach of trust, and people say, well, why are we in this organisation? Why are we voting for these clowns who are taking away the products that are keeping us healthy and safe and making us happier and making us feel better? why are we voting for them? Why are we being exposed to these dodgy underworld characters who are now supplying the products that we want to buy? What's the point of you? And then you play into the populist narrative. You get, counterproductive things like Brexit. You put wind in the sails of Orban and the Slovaks and all that. And it doesn't help the EU maintain a sense of professionalism and integrity when it does that. And there's nothing they need to do more than that right now.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure, Peter. Thank you.